This is the story of our family. As you view the story through old and not so old photos, may you feel the warmth, pride, humanity, and love, realizing that those who preceded us, as well as those still among us, represent a journey of life symbolized by humility, hard work, honor, integrity, simplicity, a joie de vivre, and a never-present faith in God. 300 years before Christ, the area known now as Avoyelles Parish, and specifically Marksville, was inhabited by prehistoric Indians. Many hundreds of years later, these nomadic and mostly peaceful Indians were eventually absorbed by the Tunica tribe, and then, when the early French settlers began moving into the area in the late 1700s, the Indians slowly moved westward. Point Coupee was also settled during the early 1700s by the French, and many pack peddlers and adventurers came over to Avoyelles from this area. One of these settlers who came from Point Coupee post was Pierre Laborde, from whom our family is descended. He migrated from France about 1780 and is believed to have landed on the west bank of the Mississippi near present-day New Roads. He was the son of Jean-Pierre Laborde from Tarbes, France, and being a surgeon, Pierre was appointed as royal surgeon for Point Coupee. In 1783, he married Modeste Lacour, and a few years later, they moved to the Avoyelles post along with many settlers who were moving there, preferring the high ground and safety from the ravages of yearly floods along the Mississippi. Pierre and Modeste had 11 children, and with no record of any other Laborde other than Pierre in Avoyelles at that time, it may be that many Labordes now living are all his descendants. These Avoyelles settlers were quite isolated, without schools, communication, or outside contact. Life was hard, and without a church or school, the people were uneducated, spoke only French, and few could read or write. However, their great tradition of devotion to the Catholic Church survived these times almost undiminished. In 1779, the parish of Mount Carmel was established at Hydropolis, or Cocoaville, located between present-day Mansoura and Marksville. But only a visiting priest served the area until a full-time priest and a convent school headed by a French order of nuns called the Daughters of the Cross were assigned there in 1824. Now, Marksville had been officially founded in 1809 by an Italian trader who accidentally settled there when his wagon wheel broke down. His name was Mark Elish, hence the name Marks Village and later Marksville. About 50 years after its founding, around 1869, the parish of Mount Carmel was disbanded and the parish of St. Joseph's was established in Marksville. On December 11, 1860, 3 generations after Pierre and Modeste Laborde arrived in Avoyelles, their grandson, Jean-Pierre Laborde, had a son named Hippolyte. Like his parents and most of his relatives, Hippolyte grew up on a small farm outside of Marksville and became a farmer working unbelievably hard on farmland inherited from his father, Jean-Pierre. In 1885, Hippolyte married Louise Porterie, a town girl from Marksville. Louise's parents, Joseph Porterie and Marie Malancy, had migrated from Giron, France around 1850, and Louise was born in 1862. This spunky, cute, petite town girl had been educated in the convent school and was quite a catch for the uneducated country farmer Hippolyte. They moved to the farm 5 miles away from town, and, besides household duties, Louise handled all the records since Hippolyte spoke no English and couldn't read or write. They had 6 children, and this petite bundle of energy ran the household, kept the farm records, grew flowers, tended the garden, milked the cows, cooked, sewed, washed the clothes, and performed all chores while raising 6 children. Like Hippolyte, she was devoutly religious and prayed with her family daily. Early on Sunday mornings, she and Hippolyte got up and dressed in their finest, then got all 6 children up and dressed, and off the family went by horse and buggy to early morning mass. How do we know all about the routine of Louise and Hippolyte's family life? Well, this is the family into which Cliff Edward Laborde, Papa to all of us, was born, the third of their 6 children. Ethel, the only girl, was born first, followed by Barclay, Cliff Edward, born on February 2nd, 1890, Armand, Romain, and Emmerich. Cliff's character, like those of his siblings, was molded by the events and people around him, and his parents had an absolute dedication to the proposition that their children had to be educated at all costs, and these costs were substantial. A 5-mile commute on horseback to Marksville to the convent school and later to the newly built high school. It meant that because the children were in school, Hippolyte and Louise had very little help with the farming and household chores. Because they were known as the country kids, they had to endure the insults of the more affluent town kids, but Hippolyte and Louise accepted no excuse to interfere with the children's education. After high school, Barclay and Cliff were enrolled in Spring Hill College, a Jesuit institution in Mobile, Alabama. The local priest was helpful in making arrangements for them, as there was no question but that they would go to a Catholic institution. More than once, Cliff and Barclay had to stay out of school in order to make a crop or sell some cattle in order to pay for tuition for the remainder of the session. A sad event occurred while Cliff and Barclay were at Spring Hill, one which affected Cliff deeply for the rest of his life. In his second year, Barclay contracted tuberculosis and had to return home, where he soon died. His death was very traumatic for Cliff, and he often spoke of it for the rest of his life. Cliff was still in his teens when he lost his beloved brother, and no doubt the remaining years at Spring Hill without Barclay were difficult for him. He graduated in 1909 at the age of 19 and a half in liberal arts, qualifying him as a school teacher. Fortunately, he was selected for the position of principal of the elementary school in Hesma, Louisiana, which was near Marksville. So he lived with his family and commuted daily by horse and buggy or horseback. Now it happened that during his 2 years there, he became seriously involved with a certain young lady from Marksville, Hilda Ann Morrow, who just happened to be a teacher also, and whose home just happened to be on the route between Cliff's home and the Hesma school. But we are getting a little ahead of the story, so let's turn back to the Morrow side of the story. Backing up to the 1700s again, a certain Joseph Valentin Morrow was born in 1709 in Quebec, Canada, then a French colony, and in a nutshell, his job as a crewman on trading canoes brought him through the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi, all the way to Louisiana, and then on to present-day Mobile, Alabama, where several of his children were born. He and his family moved on to New Orleans and later turned up at the Opelousas post. One can only marvel at the extent of his travels from Quebec to the Louisiana Territory in the 1700s. Now, Joseph Morrow had a large family, but the child we are most interested in is Pierre Celestin, born about 1774, and who eventually married Adelaide Goudot from Point Coupee in 1792. Celestin and Adelaide soon moved to Avoyelles, and one of his sons, Celestin II, born in 1799, is of interest to us. Celestin II married Manette Roxanne Coco in 1823, and unlike his brothers and sisters who remained down the bayou on Bayou de Glace and established the town of Moorville, Celestin and Roxanne moved up to the high ground of Avoyelles near present-day Marksville and operated a large farm there. As expected, he too had a large family, and among them born in 1843 were twin boys, one named Lucien Ferrier and the other named Ferdinand. The Morrow family enjoyed the good life. The children were educated both at the Coqueville Convent School and later at the Jesuit boarding school in Bardstown, Kentucky. The family had slaves to do the heavy chores, and the boys, Ferrier and Ferdinand, had time to enjoy such sports as hunting and fishing. When the Civil War broke out in 1860, both boys left school and began an unbelievable and incredible series of experiences while serving in the Confederacy. They joined a light artillery company called Boone's Battery, and their experiences, no doubt, left an incredible mark on their lives. They fired on Federal gunboats in the Mississippi near Baton Rouge at Port Hudson. They crossed the Mississippi at night to set up their artillery. They were involved in the siege at Port Hudson for 44 days and 44 nights. They survived by eating horses and mules and later only a handful of corn a day. They finally had to surrender and march 30 miles to Jackson, Louisiana as prisoners. They were later released and ended up in Shreveport. It was there that the twins separated, and Ferrier was once again captured in northern Mississippi, sent to New Orleans, then to Ship Island off the Mississippi coast, and later to Vicksburg. When the war ended in 1865 and he was released, he walked from Vicksburg to Marksville, a distance of several hundred miles, living off the land along the way. Upon his return home, he found the home situation in shambles. The slaves had been freed, the economy was in ruin, and carpetbag Reconstruction forces were in charge. Amid this chaos, in 1867, Ferrier married Estelle Coco, a first cousin and daughter of Dominique Coco II, and on a sizable tract of land inherited from his father, he began to run the farm. Unlike the struggling Laborde family a few miles away, who worked so much harder, did all the work themselves, and hardly enjoyed life as much, the tall, handsome Ferrier, easygoing, low-key, and enthusiastic hunter and fisherman, managed to live in the grand style of his ancestors, with many farm workers and household help. In 1885, his young wife Estelle died, leaving behind her husband Ferrier and 5 children, the youngest being only 2 years old. So a couple of years later, in 1887, 34-year-old Lucy Ann Snoddy, a tall, quiet, sentimental, and deeply religious woman, married the widower Ferrier Moreau. They were a handsome couple, and theirs was a happy union, with the stately, serious, dignified, educated lady of Scotch-Irish ancestry, Lucy, taking over the role of mother to the 5 children, and later giving birth to 2 more children, Hilda Ann Moreau, Mama to all of us, born on January 8, 1890, followed by Dallas 2 years later. Now, Hilda was very much like her mother, Lucy, in that she too was tall, pretty, serious, and very studious. She was always very close to her little brother Dallas and often helped him with his studies and protected him from the older boys who liked to tease him. Hilda and Dallas attended the convent school in Marksville, walking 1.5 miles each way every day, and it was not long before the local pastor singled her out as an exceptional student and suggested that she go off to college, as she had mastered all that she could at the little school. With great protest, Hilda's parents agreed to let her go to St. Mary's Dominican Academy in New Orleans, even though she was only 14 years old. And in the fall of 1904, Hilda, who had never been away from home, boarded the train for New Orleans and Dominican. The first months were agonizing for her, and she cried herself to sleep every night, worrying about her brother and lonesome for her parents. The strange new world around her, with sophisticated city girls from all parts of the country, was terrifying to her, especially since she was only 14 years old. But in time, with the help from a one special Mother Mary DeRicci, Hilda eased into her new life and adapted to her new surroundings and people. She began making friends, excelled in academics, becoming the top in her class and leader of her peers. Hilda continued to thrive at Dominican, graduating with highest honors in 1908 at the age of 18. Returning to Marksville, she began a teaching career which took her to the 2-room school in Bruyette near Marksville and later to the Gremillon School nearer her home. Now, as the story played out, it may or may not be coincidental, but Hilda's home and the school where she taught, going daily by horse and buggy, were located between Cliff's home and the Hesma School where he was principal. Could it be that they met up with each other daily as they were both going to and from their schools by horse and buggy? At any rate, during that time their relationship blossomed, and when Cliff was appointed to a new position as principal of Vinton High School in Vinton, Louisiana, a small town in southwestern Louisiana, it probably dawned on him to ask for Hilda's hand in marriage. Of course, she accepted, and on August the 7th, 1912, they were married at St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Marksville, and afterwards headed to Bay St. Louis, Mississippi by train for a brief honeymoon. From there, they once more boarded a train for Vinton and rented a small cottage in town as their first home. In those days, married ladies were not allowed to teach in the public schools, so Hilda busied herself with housekeeping in her new little home. As a dedicated educator all of his life, Cliff was a strict principal, a true disciplinarian who still endeared himself to the parents, students, and community. He was even a baseball coach, and in later years bragged that one of his players, Ted Lyons, went on to become a star major league player. A year later, on June 30th, 1913, Cliff and Hilda's first child, a son, was born, and he was named Cliff Edward Laborde, Jr. C.E., as he was always called, was a fine, healthy baby, but almost a year later, just when he was beginning to walk, he became deathly ill with infantile paralysis, now known as polio. Needless to say, this was a defining event in the lives of this young couple, and they spoke of it often during the rest of their lives. With no known treatment and an often fatal outcome of this disease, the family was quarantined for several weeks. C.E. survived and recovered from the acute stages of the disease, only to be left with a severely crippled left leg for the rest of his life. Groping for possible cures, Hilda took the baby on a special quarantine drawing room on the train to a sanitarium in New Orleans called the Water Cure. This involved giving the baby therapeutic baths daily by immersing C.E. in hot water followed by freezing water. Hilda often recalled how terrible it was to helplessly watch her baby being treated so, and his screams haunted her well into her old age. C.E.'s leg atrophied and his ankle was bent, but finally around 2.5 years old, he learned to walk on his crippled bent foot. Later on, when he was about 5 or 6, reconstructive surgery was done by a Dr. Hatch at Toureau Infirmary in New Orleans, and the foot was straightened somewhat. With specially constructed shoes, he walked for the rest of his life, and his decided limp proved to be no handicap to his success and happiness in his life of 70 years. During the long ordeal with her firstborn, Hilda's brother Dallas moved in with them, seeking advice, help, and support in finding a job since he had dropped out of school. In addition, baby number 2, another boy, Alden James, arrived on December 18, 1915, 2.5 years after C.E.'s birth. Later, Cliff's youngest brother, Emmerich, also moved in for a while, looking for direction, advice, and maybe employment. And just when Cliff's excellent reputation as an administrator and educator was being recognized by many, he was offered the position of principal of Marksville High School in 1918. At this same time, baby number 3, a third son, Lucien Paul Laborde, who was named after his grandfather, Lucien Ferrier Moreau, arrived on April 5, 1918. Accepting the position in Marksville meant picking up and moving a family of 5, including a new baby. It was a difficult decision. Hilda and Cliff's 5 years in Vinton were tumultuous but happy and successful ones. However, their roots ran deep. Their parents were getting old, and they just couldn't turn down the job offer. So, packing up the 3 little boys and their belongings in their new Ford touring car with bag and baggage and kids, they drove the 150 miles in 12 hours on bumpy, dusty roads back to Marksville. Once again, the family rented a little cottage near the school. They were happy to be back in Marksville, but there remained a certain amount of nostalgia for Vinton, where they had been so happy, had been so well received by the community, and had made so many good friends. Coming back home meant that Cliff had to prove himself in the minds of the town folk, since he was still, in their minds, a country boy, and Hilda had to set up housekeeping with the three little ones. It was at this time in their lives that they were introduced to Father Van de Putten, the newly installed pastor of St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Marksville. And there began a long and deep friendship with the family and Father Van that continued through the next generation until his death in 1975. Father Van, as he was affectionately known by everyone, was a remarkable, very intelligent Dutchman who spoke at least 4 languages, plus Latin. He was a strong but kind leader who could be quite stern and stubborn at times, but whose incredible knowledge of human nature, a keen sense of humor and common sense played a large role in the life of the community, and he endeared himself to all, young and old. His influence on Hilda and Cliff, as well as their children, grandchildren, and the whole community, was profound. With a twinkle in his eye and a pipe or cigar in his mouth, he was at ease with everyone, whether working on official duties as pastor and later as a Monsignor, ministering to his flock, or sipping coffee on Cliff and Hilda's back porch, or later on a stool in C.E. and Bertie's kitchen, watching the commotion of their large family and entertaining everyone with his usual wit and wisdom. A prince of a fellow, a prince of the church, a true prince of peace. About a year after the move to Marksville in 1919, Cliff and Hilda bought an old 1847 antebellum home situated on almost 5 acres of land. It came with a barn which is still standing today on the site which is now the home of Laura and Reuben Dozal. It provided room for a garden, which Cliff loved, and a pasture for milk cows and chickens. And then, on March 25, 1921, another baby arrived, and this time it was a little girl, Marguerite Sienna Laborde, soon given the nickname Tappy. And finally, when baby number 5 was on the way, and the hope was perhaps a baby sister for Tappy, guess what? Another boy arrived, given the namesake of the Laborde ancestor Jean-Pierre. John Peter Laborde was born on November 5th, 1923. Life in Marksville was simple, easygoing, and pleasant for this busy family, now numbering 7. Hilda, Cliff, 4 boys, and 1 girl. The children were in no way deprived, although a school principal's salary was quite modest. The children grew and thrived, performed household chores, and no doubt had their share of squabbles and disagreements. Can't you just see all of them piling into the car for a ride around town, all arguing and quarreling about where each would sit? No one wanted the way back, of course, and Cliff eventually had to settle the arguments. Activities for everyone usually were associated with church, school, and family, and many a memorable time was spent at the grandparents' homes. And so Cliff and Hilda raised their family in a loving, disciplined manner, always stressing education, studying hard, and of course faith in God. Cliff was a conservative, God-fearing man, a true educator, not very emotional or sentimental, hard-working, and of course always expressing his belief of moderation in all things. He revealed a kindness and a sparkle of humor along with his sternness and seriousness, and he continually stressed the importance of honesty and integrity in all matters of life. His reputation as a true educator resulted in his appointment as Superintendent of Schools for Avoyelles, a position he held for 14 years. Hilda, on the other hand, was just the opposite, sentimental, very emotional, and sensitive. She used praise and encouragement to stimulate her children. She was an excellent cook, played the piano, and was of the belief that one could spoil a child as long as it didn't affect his or her character. One of her favorite of many sayings repeated often by her was that Love is a flame that must be constantly rekindled to keep from diminishing. The children grew up, attended the convent school and later Marksville High School, where in 1929, at age 15 and a half, C.E. graduated and went to LSU. 3 years later, in 1932, Alden followed C.E. to LSU, and the next year, in 1933, Lucian graduated from Marksville High School and joined his brothers at LSU. With 3 children in college and the Great Depression upon the whole country, things were pretty tight financially for the family. Locally, the Great Flood of 1927 devastated the southern lowland area of Avoyelles, leaving much property damage in the areas including Simsport, Hamburg, Bourdonville, Moorville, and Rexmer. The price of cotton collapsed. Farmers couldn't pay their bills nor taxes. Local banks failed, and many people lost all of their savings, including Cliff and Hilda. The economy came to a standstill, and hard lessons of life and a strong sense of values were learned from those times, and life went on. C.E. went on to law school, as he was almost preordained to one day be a lawyer. Alden, who was not particularly interested in LSU, but who enjoyed the Army ROTC program on campus, began looking with great interest into switching to West Point, partly to do something different and partly to alleviate some of the financial burden of his father. With no vacancy coming up for West Point, Alden received an appointment to attend the Naval Academy at Annapolis in the fall of 1934. It was decided that Cliff, Hilda, and their beloved Father Van would drive Alden up to Annapolis, and on June 6, 1934, they arrived at Annapolis. In the meantime, C.E. had completed law school, graduating in 1933 at the age of 20, and after taking the bar exam, he had to wait until he was 21 the following year before he could be admitted to the bar. In 1934, he hung his shingle on the Laborde Building, situated on Main Street in Marksville. Emmerich, Cliff's brother, built the first half of the building in 1926, and Cliff built the other half in 1934. There, C.E. began what was to be a long and successful practice, and his office always remained in that building. In 1935, with C.E. out on his own practicing law, Alden at the Naval Academy, Lucian at LSU, pursuing studies in the School of Agriculture as well as participating in ROTC, and Tappy and John still in high school, Cliff and Hilda saw the country and the world growing more unsettled. The Depression was at its worst in the area, and unemployment and bread lines were rampant. President Roosevelt's New Deal programs were being implemented, and in Louisiana, the Huey Long era of politics was in full swing. Huey Long was an excellent politician, a populist, whose political machine sought to enforce his agenda at the expense of anything and anyone. Cliff, who was never a political person, resisted the pressure of the Long administration, and consequently, after many years of loyal and scrupulously honest service as a teacher, principal, and superintendent of Avoyelles schools, Cliff was rewarded by being out of a job at age 45. About this time, Cliff, who was not a politician, decided to run for Congress, but he was defeated. This happened just after C.E. married his LSU sweetheart, Bertie, on June 8, 1937, in nearby Mansoura, and they settled down in their newly built home next door to Cliff and Hilda on South Main Street. No doubt the marriage was a happy event for all, especially since Cliff was going through such uncertain and disappointing times. After investing his life savings in an automobile dealership and realizing that selling cars was not for him, he was offered the position of Dean of Men at Southeastern University in Hammond, Louisiana. As always, Hilda was most supportive of him and a real tower of strength. She knew that as an educator, he belonged in an academic setting. So again, in 1938, the family was faced with a pending move to Hammond, and the year proved to be another busy and ever-changing one for the family. Tappy graduated from Marksville High School that year, and as a graduation gift was given a trip to Annapolis to attend Alden's graduation from the Naval Academy in June. Also that June, C.E. and Bertie's first child was born, a son, who was also the first grandchild of Hilda and Cliff. His name? Edward Theodore, named after Cliff and his star athlete Ted Lyons, whom Cliff coached in Vinton. From this point on, the proud grandparents were affectionately called Mama and Papa by their children, grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren. So at this point in the story, we'll call them Papa and Mama too. By the fall of this same year, 1938, Tappy was off to Dominican College in New Orleans, her mother's alma mater, and John, who was still in high school, enrolled in Hammond High School, where he graduated 2 years later. During the mid to late 30s, stormy war clouds were on the horizon for the world. Hitler was overrunning Europe and was poised to invade England, while Japan's invasion of China and quest for naval superiority in the Pacific was creating uneasiness and unrest here at home. When Japan and Italy united with Germany to form the Axis powers, pressure mounted on the United States and England. Japan knew that its plan to conquer Asia would not be possible as long as the United States naval fleet was strong in the Pacific. So, on that fateful day, on Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, thus igniting World War II. Our country was at war, and little did one know what kind of impact that would have on Mama and Papa and their family from that point on. During this period leading up to the war, in 1940, Papa was offered a position in the State Department of Education as superintendent of building and groups. This, of course, meant picking up and moving again, this time to Baton Rouge, where they found a large, comfortable home on Government Street. John had just graduated from Hammond High School, and so he and Tappy, who transferred from Dominican, entered LSU and lived at home. And then the war changed everything in late 1941. C.E., who was married and now had 2 children, was unable to serve as he was crippled. This fact bothered him for many, many years as he saw what his younger brothers had to endure, and he almost felt guilty at being unable to do his part for his country. Alden, who was 26, had been working in Lafayette before he was called to active duty as a Naval Reserve officer with the rank of lieutenant. Lucian, then 24, who had been working in Arkansas at the time, was quickly called up to active duty also and entered the Army as a second lieutenant. John, who was only 19 years old and still at LSU in the ROTC program as a cadet colonel, was allowed a few months to finish school before likewise being called to serve. These 3 young sons of Mama and Papa were sent to 3 different theaters of the war. Alden in the waters of the North Atlantic as commander of the USS Blair, and towards the end of the war in the Pacific as captain of the USS Kleinsmith. Lucian enduring and surviving incredible hazards and risks in the famous D-Day offensive at Omaha Beach in northern France, and later in the operations which followed across Western Europe. And John in the Pacific, first in New Guinea, then Leyte Island in the Philippines, where he was selected to serve with the advance group of General Douglas MacArthur's staff there, and later in Japan until the end of the war in 1945. The war was very hard on those left behind, and Mama and Papa suffered greatly having 3 young sons in active combat all over the world, and it took quite a toll on them. But again, Their steadfast faith in God and constant prayers for the intercession of the Blessed Mother carried them through. Mama continually prayed that her sons would be protected under his mother's cloak. Papa and Mama shared all the same worries and anxiety, and yet Papa had to provide a strong front to comfort and support Mama as she suffered greatly. By 1943, the war had taken its toll on Mama, and so they moved back into their home in Marksville. Papa maintained an apartment in Baton Rouge and continued to work for the State Department of Education, commuting back and forth each week. C.E. and Tappy, like their parents, had to endure the long days, months, and years of not knowing what was going on, imagining the worst, and waiting and praying with little or no communication except the letters from the boys. In the meantime, Tappy had graduated from LSU in 1942 and had begun teaching in New Roads, where she met a certain landowner, Alban Major. Later, on November 2, 1943, they were married in Marksville and lived in New Roads, where Alban continued to run his vast farmland. On September 23, 1944, their first child, a girl named Charlene Ann, was born. During this time of war, Alden proposed to his sweetheart Margaret B. Avenue, whom he had met and dated while working in Lafayette before the war, and on March 11, 1945, they were married in St. Martinville, Louisiana. Margaret moved to New York, where Alden was stationed, and the following year, on August 4, 1944, their first child, a girl named Susan Margaret, was born in New York. In 1945, World War II was finally over and the brothers slowly returned home. C.E., having been unable to serve in the war himself, seemed to take on the responsibility of helping all three get reestablished in civilian life. He helped Alden get a job with an oil company field crew doing seismic explorations in Avoyelles Parish. He lined up Lucien in a farming operation with his friend W.T. Nolan of Hamburg. And, besides a job, Lucien began dating W.T. Nolan's pretty daughter Peggy, and they were later married on June 27, 1948. A couple of years later, on June 16, 1950, their first child, a girl, Laura Louise, was born. By the time John arrived home from the war in August 1946, C.E. had already enrolled him in LSU Law School for the 1946 fall semester. And after graduating in June 1949, he married his LSU sweetheart, Jeannie Ziltz, in El Dorado, Arkansas, on July 2, 1949, and settled in Marksville to begin practicing law with C.E. The following year, on March 20, 1950, their firstborn, John Tracy, a boy, was born. In 1948, Papa retired from the Department of Education in Baton Rouge and gave up his apartment and moved back permanently to their home in Marksville, where he and Mama remained until his death. He was hired for the position of city manager of the town of Marksville and subsequently became involved in the Marksville Chamber of Commerce on a voluntary basis. His wise and thoughtful contribution to the chamber was invaluable to the town, and he remained an active and dedicated volunteer to the chamber for the rest of his life. Papa finally found more time to pursue his interests in his garden, his work as state deputy of the Knights of Columbus, and later as a past state deputy. He and Mama were able to travel extensively with the Knights of Columbus, going to New York, California, down to New Orleans, and even visiting Cuba. The 50s roared in, and Papa and Mama's family continued to grow, with eventually 30 grandchildren added to their 5 children. C.E. and Bertie had 9 children. Alden and Margaret had 5. Lucien and Peggy had 4. Tappy and Alban had 7. And John and Jeannie had 6, but a baby son, Mark, died as a newborn. The children grew up and the families were busy with their everyday lives. Mama and Papa exemplified their roles as matriarch and patriarch, never swaying from their deep faith in God and devotion to the church. They lived the principles of honesty, discipline, integrity, good character, humility, charity towards others, hard work, the importance of education, and of course the ever-present motto of Papa, moderation in all things. As they stood as guideposts for their family, their children were busy raising families, founding companies, farming the land, and practicing law. Family gatherings on Father's Day at the old home in Marksville were special times for all, where the cousins played and renewed friendships, the adults reminisced about old stories, and good times and good eating were enjoyed by all. In the late 50s, on August 27, 1959, Marksville celebrated its sesquicentennial and held a grand ball honoring the distinguished senior citizens of the town. Papa, at the age of 67, was selected to reign as king. It was a grand evening, and His Highness reigned over his citizens with grace and humility. His contributions throughout his life in the field of education, as well as to his church, to his community, and to his family, were duly recognized and honored, as the townspeople acknowledged his life's work and the principles by which he lived. Soon the 60s arrived, and of special note was the grand family reunion at Tappy and Alban's home in New Roads on August the 12th, 1962, celebrating the 50th wedding anniversary of Mama and Papa. All 5 children and spouses were present, along with every one of the 30 grandchildren, from Ted to Tommy. It was a truly special day, and the memory of that gathering remains a happy one. Another happy event occurred in July 1965 when Rexmer Plantation in Avoyelles was acquired by Mama and Papa's 4 sons. The corporation was named Hillcliff Farms after Hilda and Cliff, and it was hoped that the place would serve as a catalyst in bringing all family members closer by providing a gathering place for one another to get acquainted or reacquainted. At this time, Mama and Papa were both 75 years old, and their family numbered more than 50 strong. On a sadder note, on February 19, 1967, our beloved Papa died. 2 weeks earlier, on February 2nd, he had celebrated his 77th birthday at a noontime family dinner in Marksville with all 5 of his children. Mama had difficulty living without her soulmate of 55 years, and, along with her memories, she moved to New Orleans to take up residence in the Mary Joseph Residence for the Elderly and later the Chateau de Notre Dame. The 70s came around, and again life was sadly punctuated by the untimely death of Tappy's husband, Alban, on September the 4th, 1970, leaving behind his 7 children and a few grandchildren. Tappy continued to live in New Roads caring for her children, and on August 18, 1975, she married Jay LeBlanc, also from New Roads, who fully embraced her large family of 7 children, their spouses, and 20 grandchildren. Also, the 70s brought the loss of another dear and cherished friend of the entire family, Father Van, who died in June 1975. To those who knew and loved him, he is remembered as a strong yet kind shepherd of his flock, and his influence on our lives is felt to this day. Mama continued to live in New Orleans, and all of her children prospered in their life's work, receiving recognition, accolades, successes, as they continued to live by the principles instilled into them by Mama and Papa, principles which were keyed to their ever-present faith in God. While living in New Orleans for more than 15 years, Mama had many wonderful experiences involving her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who lived there. On more than one occasion, she attended business functions related to Otico and Tidewater, the companies headed by her sons Alden and John, respectively. Once, she christened the Prince Tide, a Tidewater boat, and another time she was even caught on the dance floor with Tappy's husband Jay and later with her grandson Gary Laborde. She was able to get better acquainted with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren living in the city, as well as those who lived far away but who managed to visit her now and then. Mama felt very much at home in New Orleans, the city that had welcomed her as a young student many years before. Once the 80s arrived, big plans were being made at Rexma for the celebration of the 90th birthday of Mama on January 8, 1980. It was one of her few visits back to Avoyelles since moving to New Orleans, and it was especially wonderful having all of her children present, as well as grandchildren and great-grandchildren, spouses, old friends like the Nolans from Hamburg, Doc, Aunt Minnie, and others, including relatives from Marksville and the surrounding area. It was quite a day, filled with lots of commotion and celebration, but a quiet moment was found with C.E. in Dee's room as she watched him roast a pig for the big dinner. Sadly, 3 years later, her firstborn son, C.E., husband of Bertie for 46 years, father of 9 and grandfather of 35, died on October 1st, 1983. Losing a child, no matter what age, is always the most difficult event in a parent's life, but Mama carried on with great faith and acceptance. 2 years later, on January 8, 1985, the family once again gathered to celebrate Mama's 95th birthday at Karen and Monroe Laborde's home in New Orleans. By this time, Mama was in a wheelchair and her sight was practically gone, but her strength and presence and gratitude for her long life and wonderful family was witnessed by everyone. The following year, on January 28, 1986, just a few days after her 96th birthday, she died in New Orleans. She was buried next to Papa in the family plot in the Marksville Cemetery. Today, Mama's portrait hangs in the old Dominican College main building, now a part of Loyola University. Dominican was the place that nurtured her as a student, comforted her and her sick baby as a young mother, and later honored her as an outstanding alumna of the school. The 90s saw the family without Mama, Papa, C.E., and Albin, but remarkably, all other members were there. More marriages took place, bringing in new faces, and new babies continued to be born. One of the happy events was the marriage of John and Sylvia on August 4, 1994, and Sylvia embraced John's large family of 5 children, their spouses, and 14 grandchildren as her own. Life went along at an even faster pace in the 90s, leaving little time for families to keep in touch. To address this, Rexma's facilities were expanded, offering more accommodations and activities for the ever-growing families to spend time together, to get to know one another, to build on their common heritage, and form bonds of friendship and love as they spent relaxing, fun-filled vacation days there. Rexma is a treasured place, but the treasure is not Rexma. The treasure is the collective strength of family. From the ancestors visited in this story, to Mama and Papa, C.E., Albin, Jeannie, Bertie, Alden, Margaret, Lucian, Peggy, Tappy, Jay, John, Sylvia, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, spouses, other relatives, friends, and the extended families connected to all of these people. The treasure is made up of all of us, and it is for the safekeeping of this treasure that Rexma was envisioned, acquired, and designed. As a family gathering spot, it provides that special place to build and nourish our relationships with one another, and it offers to everyone the opportunity to be a part of that treasure. As we head into the new millennium and a new century and a new year, Let's pause to ponder the legacy handed down to us by our forebears. In Alden's book, My Life and Times, from which much of the information for this story was taken, he lists his guiding principles of life, acknowledging that, other than his parents, Mama and Papa, Father Van probably exerted more influence upon his life than any other person in forming these principles. They include faith in God, protect your good name, live within your means, speak the truth, work hard with integrity, be humble, be moderate in all things, be charitable to the less fortunate, be patriotic, be forgiving of one another, always love one another. This is the end of the story, but it leaves us with a rich legacy that will help us to continue the story through our own lives and those of our families and the families to come. Let us begin with this legacy and combine it with today's joy and the hope in the future, and surely each one of us will add a wonderful new chapter in the story of our family.